Welcome to the deep dive.
So you hear the word anarchy, and let's be real. The first thing that probably pops into your head is pure chaos, right?
Yeah.
Maybe images of disorder, riots, things burning. It's kind of the go-to shorthand for a breakdown of order.
And that common understanding is definitely out there. It's pervasive.
Yeah.
But what if we told you that anarchy is also the banner for a really sophisticated, historical, and incredibly diverse political ideology?
Okay.
That's the subject of this deep dive.
Exactly. We're peeling back the layers on anarchism as a political philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
We're drawing our insights from a fascinating source text that really digs into its history, its core beliefs, and the surprisingly wide range of forms it takes.
Our mission today is, well, to move beyond that knee-jerk chaos reaction.
Right.
We want to explore the foundational ideas of anarchism, understand its different branches, because there are quite a few, often broadly categorized as individualist or collectivist.
Okay, those two main camps. Yeah. And look at its historical attempts to build a world without the state and see why, despite never achieving national power, it still resonates today.
So the goal is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from this material just for you, the listener.
Precisely.
And it all starts with the word itself. Where does anarchy come from?
It comes from the ancient Greek word anarchos.
Anarchos.
Yeah, if you break it down, it literally means without rule or without a ruler.
Okay, so the original meaning does kind of align with that chaos idea. No ruler means disorder.
Initially, that was indeed how it was used, almost always pejoratively, describing situations where established authority had collapsed.
Yeah, a negative term.
But the real turning point, the moment the word took on a positive political identity, happened in 1840.
Okay, what happened then?
The French thinker Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, in his influential work, What is Property?, made a very deliberate declaration. He said, "I am an anarchist."
Wow. That's a powerful move, taking a negative label and claiming it proudly for your own political philosophy.
It really was a conscious act of redefinition.
What was the core idea he was embracing with that statement? What's the absolute heart of anarchism at its highest level?
The central defining premise that unites all these different strands is the belief that political authority in any shape, but especially the state, is not only evil, but also fundamentally unnecessary.
Both evil and unnecessary. That's a radical starting point.
It truly is. They see the state as evil because, well, they view it as the ultimate repository of sovereign, compulsory, and coercive authority.
Right. Power concentrated.
Exactly. And this concentration of power, they argue, is inherently oppressive and offends the core principles of freedom and equality.
Freedom and equality, key values.
Absolutely. The absolute highest value for anarchists is unrestricted personal autonomy, the complete freedom of the individual.
So the state is seen as the absolute antithesis of individual freedom.
Yes, precisely. And they see it as unnecessary because underpinning anarchist thought is a remarkably optimistic view of human nature.
Okay, that's interesting. How so?
They believe that order, cooperation, and social harmony can arise naturally and spontaneously among people.
Without needing to be forced.
Exactly, without needing to be imposed from above by any form of government or external authority. This faith in natural order is where you see the utopian dimension of anarchism.
Utopian, meaning the belief in a perfect, ideal society being possible.
Precisely. And it's fascinating because our source material highlights that anarchism isn't a philosophy that sprang from a single ideological well.
Okay.
It draws significant inspiration from two traditions that seem quite different on the surface. Liberalism.
With its focus on freedom.
Right, with its deep commitment to individual liberty and minimal constraint, and socialism.
Focus more on equality and community.
Exactly, with its focus on equality, community, and critiquing capitalist exploitation.
Okay, so it's a blend of liberalism and socialism.
It's maybe more like it exists at the extremes of both.
Okay.
It pushes the liberal emphasis on individual freedom to the point of rejecting all state authority as a constraint. And it pushes the socialist critique of hierarchy and exploitation to the point of rejecting the state as the ultimate form of oppression, even in a socialist context.
I see.
This dual parentage leads directly to the rival individualist and collectivist forms.
The two main branches again.
Yes. While they share the goal of statelessness, their visions for how that stateless society would actually function are poles apart.
That tension between individual freedom and collective organization sounds fundamental to understanding the different types of anarchism.
It absolutely is, and we'll definitely unpack that further. But first, Let's trace where these ideas came from and how they developed historically.
Okay, the origins. Where do we find the earliest echoes of anarchist thought?
Well, you can find ideas that resonate with anarchism way back in history.
Like how far back?
Some point to philosophies like Taoism and certain forms of Buddhism, which emphasize, spontaneous harmony, minimal interference, aligning with a natural order.
Interesting. Any Western example?
Others look to the Stoics and Cynics in ancient Greece, who questioned conventional authority and social norms. And even closer to home, radical groups like the English Diggers during the English Civil War.
Ah, the Diggers, right.
They challenged traditional property rights and hierarchical structures.
So threads of anti-authoritarianism and communalism have been around for a long, long time. But for a clear philosophical articulation, where does our source point?
It identifies William Godwin's Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, published in 1793.
1793, French Revolution era.
Right, as arguably the first and, in a sense, classic statement of anarchist principles in the Western tradition.
But he didn't call himself an anarchist.
No, what's interesting is that Godwin himself didn't use the term anarchist for his views.
What was Godwin arguing for then? What made his work the foundational text?
Godwin was really a product of the Enlightenment's faith and reason. He had this profoundly optimistic belief in human perfectibility through education and enlightened judgment. He argued that humans are essentially rational creatures, capable of being guided by truth and universal morality.
So basically good, or at least
Right.
rational.
Yeah, rational enough. And because of this innate rationality and capacity for moral development, he believed people could naturally organize their lives in harmony without needing external compulsion.
So government wasn't needed because people were inherently rational enough to self-govern peacefully.
Exactly. He saw government, laws, and the state not as necessary evils to restrain our baser instincts.
Which is what someone like Hobbes argued.
Right. Godwin saw them as the actual cause of injustice, greed, and conflict. By imposing unnatural laws and limiting human autonomy, the state stifled our rational and moral potential.
So government creates the problems.
That was his view. His belief was that as humanity became more enlightened and rational, the need for government would simply wither away.
Okay. Now, fast forward to the 19th century.
Right.
And anarchism really came into its own as a political force, becoming a significant part of the burgeoning socialist movement.
Yes, this is where we see more organized attempts to spread the ideas and challenge the existing order.
And this is also where the famous split with Marxism happened, right?
Absolutely. A key moment was the formation of the International Working Men's Association, the first international, in 1864.
The First International.
It brought together various radical groups, including followers of Proudhon and Marxists, led by Karl Marx himself.
But it didn't last.
No, this alliance was always fragile and ultimately collapsed, largely due to the intense antagonism between Marx's followers and the anarchists led by Mikhail Bakunin.
Bakunin, he's a really central figure in anarchist history, isn't he?
Hugely important, yes.
What was his background, and why was he so antagonistic to Marx?
Well, Mikhail Bakunin was this dynamic Russian political agitator, a revolutionary.
He's like a character.
Oh, definitely. A leading voice for collectivist anarchism. While Marx focused heavily on the economic structure of capitalism and saw the state mainly as an instrument of class rule, Bakunin was fiercely anti-authoritarian in all domains. He saw the state, the church, and capitalism itself as interlocking systems of oppression.
So, a broader critique than Marx.
In some ways, yes. He put a huge emphasis on human sociability and mutual aid, and was militantly anti-theological, seeing religion as another form of mental slavery reinforcing obedience.
Right.
His vision of revolution was more about spontaneous mass revolt against all forms of authority simultaneously, rather than the organized class-based struggle favored by Marxists.
Right. Marx had his stages, the vanguard party.
Exactly. And the core of their conflict was Bakunin's deep, deep distrust of any form of centralized power, even a temporary revolutionary state.
Which Marx advocated.
Right, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Bakunin believed that would simply recreate oppression under a new name.
So, Marx wanted to seize state power and use it to transition to communism, while Bakunin saw the state itself as the enemy to be immediately destroyed.
Precisely. That fundamental disagreement on the role of the state was just irreconcilable.
Okay, so given this split and their rejection of conventional politics, how did anarchists try to build a mass movement?
Well, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they tried to gain support among peasants in regions like Russia and Southern Europe.
With some success.
Some, But they saw a more significant success by connecting with industrial workers through a strategy called anarcho-syndicalism.
Anarcho-syndicalism.
Yeah.
That sounds like it links anarchism with trade unions.
That's exactly what it is. Syndicalism is a form of revolutionary trade unionism, taking its name from the French word syndicat for union.
Okay.
And it became remarkably popular in certain countries, especially France, Italy, and Spain.
Spain, right. I've heard about the anarchist influence there.
Absolutely. Our source highlights the influence of the CGT union in France before 1914, and most impressively, the CNT union in Spain.
The CNT.
Yeah, which claimed over 2 million members during the Spanish Civil War.
2 million members. That's huge. It's easy to think of anarchism as purely a fringe philosophy, but that number shows it had a real base in certain places and times.
It absolutely did. It wasn't just intellectuals in cafes. Anarcho-syndicalism also spread to Latin America, with movements in Argentina and Uruguay, and it influenced figures in the Mexican Revolution, like Emiliano Zapata.
Zapata. Interesting.
Yeah, his agrarian rebels sought decentralized communal land ownership, which aligns with anarchist ideas.
So this syndicalist connection reinforces that link back to the socialist or working class movements.
It does, though. Proudhon himself, with his focus on artisans and small-scale mutualism, was slightly distinct from the large-scale industrial syndicalism that came later.
So anarchism had moments of significant popular reach, particularly through this syndicalist route. But it didn't end up fundamentally reshaping societies on a national scale. What led to its decline as a mass movement?
There were two major blows, really. Firstly, the rise of authoritarian regimes and brutal political repression across Europe and Latin America.
Fascism, dictatorships.
Exactly. The Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939, was particularly devastating for them. General Franco's victory, as our source notes, essentially brought an end to anarchism as a mass movement.
Wow.
By brutally suppressing organizations like the CNT and persecuting anarchists and other left-wing groups.
Effectively crushing their biggest real-world experiment and mass base.
Yes, a truly devastating blow. And secondly, the success of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the 1917 Russian Revolution fundamentally changed the landscape of revolutionary politics.
How so?
Well, the apparent success of the communist model shifted prestige within revolutionary movements towards communism.
Because they actually took power.
Exactly. Communism was highly centralized, disciplined, contrasting sharply with anarchism's emphasis on decentralization and spontaneity. Many who were drawn to radical change gravitated towards the perceived strength and, frankly, the practical path to power offered by communism.
Right. They looked like winners.
For a time, yes.
This brings us to a really striking and unique characteristic of anarchism when you compare it to other major political ideologies.
It does. What's that?
Well, unlike liberalism, conservatism, socialism, fascism, even ideologies like feminism or fundamentalism, which are, in various ways, held or influenced state power. Anarchism has never succeeded in winning power at the national level. No society has been fundamentally restructured according to anarchist principles.
That's a crucial point. They've never successfully run a country, never had an anarchist state, which is, of course, an oxymoron anyway.
So what about their near misses, or what examples do they look to for inspiration, if not nation states?
Well, the closest they came was indeed during the Spanish Civil War, particularly in parts of eastern Spain like Catalonia, before being crushed by both Franco and actually internal conflict with communists, too.
Right.
For a brief period, anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists were effectively running industries and agriculture through workers' and peasants' collectives, a remarkable, if short-lived, practical application of their ideas under extreme pressure.
A real-world test, however brief.
Exactly. And because they haven't created a lasting, large-scale, stateless society, anarchists often point to historical or smaller-scale examples they feel embody their principles.
Like what?
Things like the decentralized structures of ancient Greek city-states or medieval European cities, traditional communal peasant organizations like the Russian Mir.
The mayor, okay.
Or stateless societies observed by anthropologists like the Nuer in Africa, known for their egalitarian structures.
Interesting anthropological examples.
And they also value and participate in modern small-scale communal living experiments as demonstrations that stateless cooperation is possible, at least on that scale.
These examples feel like pockets of statelessness or decentralization rather than blueprints for complex modern nations, though.
That's a fair observation.
And this must feed into why anarchism's widespread appeal has been limited.
It definitely does. Our source points to a couple of key reasons why anarchism hasn't achieved mass support as a political program. First, the ultimate goal itself, the complete abolition of the state and all political authority,
Hmm.
is widely seen across the political spectrum as profoundly unrealistic, maybe even utopian in the negative sense of the word.
Right, the pipe dream argument.
Exactly. Most people believe some form of state or government is necessary for order, infrastructure, resolving complex disputes. The idea of a completely stateless society often conjures that initial chaos image again.
Right, the core question becomes, if you remove the state, what steps in to prevent widespread disorder or oppression by non-state actors? Who enforces contracts? Who stops the powerful from just taking over?
Exactly. That's the fundamental challenge from critics. The second major limitation is strategic.
Also,
Anarchists largely reject conventional political means, forming parties, contesting elections, seeking state office.
because the state itself is the problem.
Right. They view these processes and institutions as inherently corrupting and counterproductive, simply serving to legitimize and perpetuate the very authority they oppose.
So if you refuse to play the conventional political game, how do you ever hope to achieve large-scale change? It seems like a catch-22.
That's their persistent strategic dilemma. By rejecting formal organization and planning, they often rely instead on the idea of mass spontaneity and a popular thirst for freedom.
Hoping people will just rise up.
Essentially, yes. The hope is that people will naturally revolt and build a new society, but history shows relying solely on spontaneous uprising is incredibly difficult to sustain for large-scale social transformation.
Okay, so historical failures, strategic challenges, yet it persists.
Yes, despite these setbacks, anarchism has proven remarkably resilient. Our source emphasizes its enduring and often strong moral appeal.
Where does that moral strength come from? Why does it keep appealing to people?
It largely stems from its uncompromising stance against authority in any form.
That purity, maybe.
Perhaps. In a world grappling with concentrations of power, state power, corporate power, institutional power, anarchism's absolute rejection of domination resonates powerfully.
Especially with younger people.
That's often the case, yes. Young people are frequently more instinctively suspicious of hierarchical structures and established authority. We see this in the anarchist presence within more recent movements, like the anti-capitalist and anti-globalization protests, which we'll discuss later. It offers a pure, unadulterated moral critique.
So even if it hasn't formed states, it continues to be a potent moral and critical force, inspiring certain forms of resistance.
Exactly. It keeps asking uncomfortable questions about power.
Let's delve deeper into those core themes that define this ideology. And the absolute defining feature, as we've emphasized, is being against the state.
Absolutely. Opposition to the state and its machinery of government and law is the non-negotiable defining characteristic. The anarchist vision is a stateless society where individuals are free and manage their collective affairs through voluntary agreement and cooperation without any form of external compulsion or coercion.
You mentioned earlier that anarchism's ideological character is a bit blurred, sitting between liberalism and socialism. How does that manifest in its critique of the state?
Well, our source highlights two factors contributing to this blurred character. Firstly, anarchism often operates more on the level of moral assertion than detailed structural analysis or explanation.
Meaning?
It proceeds from the belief that freedom and autonomy are inherent human desires, so its focus is often on awakening these instincts and critiquing the obvious manifestations of authority.
Like police brutality or censorship.
Right. Rather than providing an in-depth systematic theory of why the state functions the way it does, or how exactly its power is maintained beyond simple coercion, it's more about the feeling of oppression.
Okay, more moral outrage than detailed theory sometimes.
Sometimes, yes. Secondly, it's perhaps less a single unified ideology and more the point where both liberalism and socialism reach their most extreme anti-statist conclusions.
Right, you called it ultra-liberalism and ultra-socialism.
Exactly. Our source uses that idea. It's like the overlap between classical liberalism taken to the point of rejecting even the minimal state needed to protect individual rights, and socialism taken to the point of rejecting even a temporary transitional state. You can visualize it as a spectrum where anarchism is way out on the extremes of both liberal freedom and socialist equality in their rejection of state power.
So whether they prioritize freedom, like individualists, or equality, like collectivists, they converge on the state as the primary obstacle.
Exactly. They attack the state from different angles, but they all agree it must go. This shared anti-statism is the bedrock.
But it's connected to other core themes, too.
Oh, yes. Utopianism, anti-clericalism, and a focus on economic freedom are all deeply intertwined with this anti-state position.
Let's stick with the anti-statism for a moment. The critique goes beyond just the state, to authority in general, right?
That's a really important point. As Sebastian Faure put it in his Encyclopedia Anarchist, anarchism is fundamentally the negation of the principle of authority.
Negating authority itself.
Yes. The core argument against authority is straightforward from their perspective. It's inherently incompatible with freedom and equality.
Because authority implies a power dynamic where one person directs another, and inequality.
Precisely. Anarchism, perhaps uniquely among major political philosophies, aims for absolute freedom and unrestrained political equality. Authority, by its very nature, is based on inequality. Someone must be above or empowered to command another.
And they see that as inherently bad.
Inherently enslaving, oppressive, and limiting to human flourishing.
Okay.
And the critique goes deeper. They argue that authority corrupts not just the person being subjected, but also the person wielding it.
Both sides are damaged.
Yes. The subject is diminished, their natural capacities suppressed, leading to dependency. The person in authority, even contexts we might see as benign, like, say, expert authority, doctors, teachers.
Even them.
Even them, because it's based on unequal knowledge distribution. The argument is they develop an appetite for prestige, control, and ultimately domination. This is the psychology of power, a pattern of dominance and submission that poisons human relationships.
That's a dark view of power dynamics.
It is. As the U.S. anarchist Paul Goodman describes such a society, many are ruthless and most live in fear.
That psychological angle is powerful. It paints a picture where power itself is inherently damaging to the human psyche on both sides.
It does. But while they critique authority broadly, their most focused and radical rejection is reserved for political authority, especially the modern state.
That's the main target.
Absolutely. This is the stance that truly makes them stand out from almost every other political ideology. Even Marxists, who see the state as an instrument of class rule, envisioned a transitional state before it eventually withers away. Anarchists say no, the state is evil in itself, right now, always.
To get a real sense of the depth of their feeling against the state, we have to revisit that famous quote from Proudhon. It's quite something.
It really captures the sentiment, he wrote. To be governed is to be watched over, inspected, spied on, directed, legislated, regimented, closed in, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, assessed, evaluated, censored, commanded, all by creatures that have neither the right nor the wisdom nor the virtue.
Wow. You can just hear the sheer claustrophobia and indignation in that language. It's not just abstract rule, it's this pervasive, constant, unwarranted intrusion into every single aspect of life.
Exactly. And anarchists articulate precisely why they see the state as uniquely oppressive beyond just that feeling. Firstly, it possesses sovereign and unlimited authority. Its laws claim jurisdiction over almost everything: public life, political activity, economic decisions, even aspects of private morality and thought. There's no inherent boundary to its potential reach.
It can interfere anywhere.
Potentially, yes. Secondly, its authority is compulsory. Anarchists reject the liberal notion that we consent to government through a social contract.
I don't buy that.
Not at all. They argue you are subjected to state power simply by accidents of birth or location or through conquest. It's not a voluntary arrangement. You are born into its authority whether you like it or not.
You don't choose it.
No. Thirdly, it is a coercive body. Laws aren't suggestions. They are backed by the threat of punishment, enforced by agents with the power to use force. Emma Goldman famously listed the symbols of government as the club, the gun, the handcuff, or the prison.
Stark images.
Very. The state has the unique power to deprive you of your property through fines, your liberty through imprisonment, and even your life through capital punishment.
The ultimate power.
Indeed. Fourthly, they see it as inherently exploitative. It forcibly extracts property through taxation, backed by the threat of coercion. And anarchists often argue that the state works hand in glove with the wealthy and privileged, using its power to protect their interests and further oppress the poor and weak.
So it takes from you and helps the rich.
That's a common anarchist critique. Finally, they view it as destructive, primarily because states cause wars.
Wars.
Yes. As Randolph Bourne famously put it, war is the health of the state. In this view, individuals are conscripted, forced to kill, and die in conflicts driven by the state's pursuit of power, territory, resources, or national glory.
That's a comprehensive indictment. It covers everything from personal intrusion to global conflict. What view of human nature supports this incredibly pessimistic view of state power? It seems contradictory to their optimism elsewhere.
This is where the utopian dimension intersects in a complex way. Anarchists hold a deeply optimistic view of human potential. They believe people can be cooperative, sympathetic, and sociable.
Okay, the potential is there.
But they pair this with a profound pessimism about the corrupting influence of power and inequality.
So it's not that humans were born bad, but that power makes them bad. The circumstances corrupt them.
Essentially, yes. Individuals who might otherwise be cooperative and good become tyrannical and oppressive when they are elevated into positions of power, privilege, or wealth.
Power corrupts.
Our source suggests anarchists take Lord Acton's famous dictum, "Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely," and radicalize it further. They believe power in any shape or form, even seemingly small or benign, will corrupt absolutely.
Any power corrupts absolutely. That's strong.
Very. And the state, being the ultimate concentration of power and authority, is therefore the ultimate manifestation of this corrupting evil.
Okay. Now, it's important to note this anarchist theory of the state isn't without its critics, right?
Oh, absolutely. Our source acknowledges this. Concerns are raised about whether the theory of human nature is a little too plastic. Are there some negative impulses more basic to us that can't simply be wished away or blamed entirely on circumstances?
Like innate aggression or greed.
Perhaps. And there's the point that the argument can feel a bit circular.
How so?
If oppression stems from corruption by circumstances, like holding power, how did authority and those corrupting circumstances arise in the first place before they had a chance to do their corrupting? Where did the first inequality come from?
That's a fair point. A bit of a chicken and egg problem.
It is. But let's put the anarchist view in context by looking briefly at how other major ideologies see the state. It really highlights how radical they are.
Okay, quick comparison. Liberals.
Liberals generally see the state as a neutral arbiter, necessary for order. Classical liberals want it minimal, a necessary evil. Modern liberals see it playing a more positive role in promoting freedom and equality.
Conservatives.
Conservatives tend to view the state positively as vital for authority, discipline, protecting society from chaos. Traditional conservatives favor a strong state for order, while neoliberals want to roll it back economically, seeing it as a threat to prosperity and driven by bureaucratic self-interest.
Socialists. More complex there.
Very. Marxists historically saw it as an instrument of class rule to be eventually abolished, or, in some interpretations, to manage class tensions. Other socialists, like social democrats or state collectivists, see it as the embodiment of the common good and approve of extensive state intervention for welfare and equality.
Fascists.
They see the state as a supreme ethical ideal, demanding total subservience, like in Italian totalitarianism, or as a vessel or tool for the race or nation, like the Nazis.
Feminists.
Often critique the state as an instrument of male power, a patriarchal state that excludes or subordinates women, though liberal feminists might see it as a potential instrument for reform and advancing women's rights.
And fundamentalists.
They often see the state positively as a means of social, moral, and cultural renewal, viewing it as the political manifestation of religious authority.
Looking across that whole spectrum, from seeing the state as a minimal necessity, to a positive good, to a tool for class or national power, to a patriarchal instrument, to a manifestation of divine will. The anarchist position stands completely alone in its absolute unqualified rejection. Every other major ideology finds some reason or role for the state, whether it's minimal or total.
Every single one.
Anarchists say, no, it's evil and unnecessary, get rid of it entirely.
That contrast really underscores just how radical the anarchist anti-statist position is. It's not just a critique, it's a fundamental rejection of the entire concept of political authority as embodied by the state.
And that total rejection of the state is tied directly to the next core theme, utopianism.
Right.
Anarchists don't just think the state is bad. They genuinely believe society can function perfectly well, even thrive, without it. It is fundamentally unnecessary.
This is where William Godwin's counter-argument to social contract theorists like Hobbes and Locke is so important.
Right. Hobbes and Locke thought life without a state would be awful.
Exactly. Hobbes famously called it a war of all against all. They believed the state was absolutely necessary to restrain those selfish, aggressive human impulses and guarantee order. Their view was basically order impossible without law imposed from above.
So the state is the essential solution to the problem of unruly human nature.
That's the classical liberal view. Godwin completely flips this on its head.
How?
As we discussed, he saw humans as fundamentally rational, guided by reason and morality. He believed there's a natural human propensity to organize lives harmoniously and peacefully.
So we're naturally orderly.
or capable of achieving order through reason. In his view, it's not human nature that causes disorder, but the unnatural laws and institutions of government that generate injustice, greed, and aggression.
So the state actually causes the disorder it claims to prevent.
That's the anarchist argument stemming from Godwin. Government, far from being the solution to disorder, was, in Godwin's eyes, its primary cause. It corrupted people.
It makes sense within their framework. It echoes Rousseau's famous line, "Man was born free, yet everywhere he is in chains," which anarchists would deeply sympathize with.
They certainly would. At the heart of anarchism, particularly its collectivist forms, is what our source calls an unashamed utopianism.
Unashamedly idealistic.
Yes, a belief in the natural goodness, or at least the profound potential for goodness, in humankind. They genuinely believe that social order will arise naturally and spontaneously if left undisturbed by external authority. You don't need the coercive machinery of law and order to impose it.
This idea of spontaneous harmony definitely requires a significant dose of optimism about human nature, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. Collectivist anarchists specifically emphasize the human capacity for sociable and cooperative behavior, stressing the inherent value of social solidarity, mutual aid, as Kropotkin called it.
And individualists, how do they see order emerging?
Individualist anarchists, while focused on the individual, might rely more on enlightened human reason, or the idea that mutual self-interest within a completely free market will guide peaceful interaction and spontaneous order.
Okay, different mechanisms, but the same faith in spontaneous order.
Largely, yes. Sometimes this belief in natural order extends beyond human nature to a broader view of the universe itself.
How so?
Some anarchists are drawn to philosophies or religions like Taoism or Zen Buddhism, which emphasize natural harmony, interdependence, and the idea that aligning with this natural flow is key to order and peace.
Interesting, a kind of ecological connection.
Yes, and this is also seen in modern social ecology, associated with thinkers like Murray Bookchin, which links ecological balance directly to decentralized, non-hierarchic social organization. Eco-anarchism draws on this.
So it's not just about human potential, but potentially about tapping into a fundamental order in reality itself.
For some strands, yes, it's part of a broader worldview. However, it's important to note, as our source does, that the anarchist view of human nature isn't always simplistically good.
Right.
Thinkers like Proudhon, Bakunin, and Kropotkin were astute observers of humanity. They accepted that humans could exhibit selfish and competitive behaviors alongside their capacity for sociability and cooperation. They recognized the potential for corruption definitely lurks within us.
So not perfectly good, but maybe plastic. Malleable.
Exactly. Human nature is seen as plastic, heavily shaped by social, political, and economic circumstances. Corrupting institutions like the state, law, and government breed that dominance and submission, the negative traits.
But good institutions could bring out the good side.
That's the idea. Nurturing institutions, whether that's common ownership and mutualist structures for collectivists, or the pure, unregulated market for individualists, can foster respect, cooperation, and allow that spontaneous harmony to emerge.
Okay. Despite this nuance, our source acknowledges that this core belief in a stable, peaceful, stateless society is frequently seen as the weakest and most contentious aspect of anarchist theory.
It is a major point of criticism, yes.
Why?
Critics argue that if negative impulses like aggression, greed, desire for power are truly basic to human nature and not just externally caused or shaped, then relying on natural order without any external restraint is simply unrealistic or, frankly, a delusion. It ignores the potential for chaos or tyranny from non-state actors.
It's a very high bar for human potential or rationality or cooperative spirit. And you mentioned that this utopianism varies between anarchist forms.
Yes, it's generally most strongly emphasized and explored in the collectivist tradition, particularly in anarcho-communism, which envisions a society built entirely on communal solidarity and shared resources.
And less so for individualists.
It's less central to the individualist tradition, which might rely more on reasoned contracts or market mechanisms for order, rather than innate goodness. And some anarcho-capitalists, like the economist David Friedman, explicitly reject utopianism altogether.
Really? How do they justify anarchism then?
They focus instead on the practical argument that market mechanisms can simply provide services currently offered by the state more efficiently and effectively without relying on any particular theory of human perfection or inherent goodness. It's more about efficiency and freedom of contract.
Okay, that gives us a clear picture of the anti-state core and the utopian ideal with its variations. Let's move on to another historical target of anarchist hostility: organized religion, or anti-clericalism.
Right. While the state is the primary enemy, anarchist hostility extends to any form of compulsory authority.
And religion was seen as one of those.
Absolutely. In the 19th century, when anarchism was prominent, this naturally included the church and organized religion, especially in countries like Spain, France, and Italy, where the church wielded significant social and political power.
So it tapped into existing anti-church feelings.
Exactly. It became a key way anarchism could articulate widespread anti-clerical sentiment.
Why specifically religion? What's the anarchist critique there?
There are several related reasons. Firstly, religion is often seen as a fundamental source of authority in itself. The concept of God frequently represents a supreme being, the ultimate, unquestionable authority to whom humans must submit.
Challenging God's authority.
Yes. Figures like Proudhon and Bakunin saw the rejection of Christianity, for instance, as absolutely necessary for human freedom and independence. How can you be truly autonomous if you're subject to divine command?
Makes sense from their perspective. What else?
Secondly, anarchists have historically seen a deep and problematic alliance between religious and political authority.
Church and state working together.
Precisely. Bakunin's declaration that the abolition of the church and the state must be the first and indispensable condition of the true liberation of society highlights this view. They see religion as reinforcing obedience and submission to earthly rulers. Think of, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
And rulers throughout history have used claims of divine right or religious legitimacy to shore up their political power.
Using religion to control people.
That's the critique. Finally, organized religion often imposes a set of rigid moral principles and behavioral codes, policed by religious authorities like priests or imams. Anarchists argued this robs the individual of their moral autonomy.
Their ability to decide right and wrong for themselves.
Exactly. Their capacity to think for themselves and make their own ethical judgments based on reason or empathy rather than external dogma.
So it's another layer of external rule and control that stifles individual freedom and moral independence. Fits the pattern.
Exactly. It aligns perfectly with their fundamental opposition to imposed authority. However, it's worth noting that this isn't necessarily a total rejection of the religious impulse or spirituality itself.
Oh, how so?
Our source points to a mystical, almost spiritual strain within some anarchist thought. A high conception of human nature's potential, a utopian belief in self-development, and a sense of the bonds that unite humanity. Interesting. Like political spirituality.
In a way. Early anarchists were sometimes influenced by millenarianism, the belief in a coming period of perfect divine rule or sudden cataclysmic emancipation. Some have seen anarchism itself as a kind of secular political millenarianism.
A belief in a radical transformation.
Yes. And more recently, some modern anarchists have found resonance in non-Western traditions like Taoism and Zen Buddhism.
Why those?
Because they often emphasize personal insight, toleration, respect, and aligning with spiritual harmony, rather than submitting to external dogma or hierarchical authority. That resonates with anarchist values.
So it's a rejection of hierarchy and imposed dogma in religion, not necessarily a rejection of spirituality or a search for meaning itself.
Precisely. It's consistent with their core anti-authoritarianism.
Okay. Beyond political and religious authority, anarchists are also fundamentally interested in challenging the structures of social and economic life.
Absolutely. As Bakunin put it very pointedly, political power and wealth are inseparable.
You can't separate the two.
In his view, no. In the 19th century, they were deeply embedded within the working class movement and shared many socialist critiques of capitalism.
Right, they saw capitalism as exploitation.
Yes, they saw capitalism broadly in class terms, much like socialists, with a ruling class exploiting the masses. However, their definition of this ruling class was often broader than just economic capitalists.
Who else did they include?
It included anyone who held significant wealth, power, or privilege, kings, politicians, state officials, judges, police, bishops, priests, industrialists, bankers, basically anyone benefiting from the system of authority and exploitation.
A very broad definition of the enemy.
Yes. Bakunin, for example, describes society as having a vast exploited majority, a minority who are both exploited and exploit others, like middle managers maybe, and a tiny supreme governing estate consisting of pure exploiters and oppressors.
Okay, so they identified with the poor and oppressed.
Strongly.
And sought a revolution that would dismantle both capitalism and the state simultaneously.
Yes, that was the core 19th century revolutionary goal. But it's in the realm of economics that the inherent tension within anarchism, drawing from both liberal individualism and socialist collectivism, is most clearly exposed.
Ah, right. This is where the individualist-collectivist split really shows up.
Exactly. This area creates the fundamental division between the two main traditions.
Because they have fundamentally different ideas about how a stateless economy should actually be organized.
Exactly. Collectivist anarchists, rooted in socialism, advocate for an economy based on cooperation and collective ownership of the means of production.
Sharing resources.
Yeah. Individualist anarchists, rooted in liberalism, support market exchange and private property. These are fundamentally opposing visions for economic life without a state.
That's a pretty significant split. It seems hard to reconcile. But they must agree on some economic critiques. Do they find any common ground?
They absolutely do. Despite their differing visions of a stateless economy, they share a strong and unified distaste for the dominant economic systems of the 20th century.
Like what?
They both oppose managed capitalism, as seen in post-1945 Western states, welfare states, mixed economies.
Why? From different angles, presumably.
Yes. Collectivists argue state intervention merely props up capitalist exploitation, maybe makes it look nicer, gives it a deceptive human face, but doesn't end the fundamental injustice.
Okay. And individualists?
Individualists argue state intervention distorts free markets, creates harmful monopolies, leads to inefficiency, and empowers bureaucrats.
So both hate state intervention in the economy, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
What about Soviet-style communism?
United disapproval there, too, maybe even stronger. Individualist anarchists object vehemently to its complete violation of private property rights and individual freedom.
Obviously.
And collectivist anarchists argue that state socialism is a flat-out contradiction in terms.
How so?
They argue the state simply replaces the capitalist class as the source of exploitation and oppression. It's not true socialism, which requires freedom, but just another form of authoritarian domination. State capitalism, essentially.
So neither state-managed capitalism nor state-controlled socialism is acceptable to any anarchist.
Correct. What they want is an economy run by free individuals managing their own affairs without state ownership or regulation.
Okay. But this shared rejection of existing systems still allows for vastly different positive visions.
Well, precisely. This shared preference for a stateless economy opens the door to endorsing a wide range of potential systems, from the fully communal anarcho-communism at one extreme,
Sharing everything.
to the purely market-driven anarcho-capitalism at the other.
Private property, markets for everything.
Yes, quite the spectrum.
Let's start by diving into the collectivist side. Where does it draw its philosophical strength? What are the core ideas?
Its philosophical roots are firmly in socialism, as we've said. It takes socialist ideals of cooperation, community, and equality, and pushes them to their logical conclusion: a stateless society based on collective principles. The core belief is that humans are fundamentally social animals, and their well-being is best served by working together for the common good rather than pursuing individual self-interest alone.
Emphasizing cooperation over competition.
Exactly. They stress social solidarity, which Peter Kropotkin famously explored through his theory of mutual aid.
Kropotkin, again, a key figure here. Tell us more about his idea of mutual aid. It sounds important.
It is central to anarcho-communism. Kropotkin was actually a geographer as well as an anarchist theorist.
Oh, interesting background.
Yeah. And he tried to provide a biological basis for cooperation. He re-examined Darwinian evolution, arguing that species are successful not primarily through ruthless competition, the survival of the fittest individual, but through cooperation within the species.
So cooperation is evolutionary advantageous.
That was his argument. He believed evolution strengthens sociability, suggesting humans have a strong, innate propensity for mutual aid, helping and supporting each other.
Where did he see evidence for this?
He saw this flourishing in historical examples like medieval city-states, guilds, traditional peasant communes. He argued this natural tendency was being suppressed and undermined by competitive capitalism and the centralized state. His point was that cooperation was natural and beneficial, not something that needed to be forced by a state.
A natural basis for a cooperative society.
Yes. Collectivist anarchism also shares significant theoretical ground with Marxism, which explains why they initially worked together in places like the First International.
Right. You mentioned the overlap. What are the key points again?
Both fundamentally reject capitalism, see structural injustice, endorse the idea of revolution, favor collective ownership of wealth in some form, believe in an eventual society without a state or classes, and share a faith in humanity's capacity for self-ordering without external authority, echoing Marx's idea of the state eventually withering away.
So lots of overlap in the critique and the ultimate goal. But you mentioned bitter disagreements earlier, especially about how to get there. The transition period.
Yes, the path to revolution and the role of the state during that transition were the source of intense, irreconcilable conflict.
What was the first point of friction?
Firstly, anarchists vehemently dismissed parliamentary socialism, trying to achieve socialism through elections and government. They argued it was a contradiction in terms.
Why?
You can't use the corrupt machinery of government, designed to uphold the status quo, to fundamentally change capitalism or abolish the state. Expanding the state, even in the name of workers or equality, simply entrenches oppression in their view.
Okay, no working within the system.
Definitely not. But the most bitter disagreement was over the Marxist concept of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat.
The temporary workers' state.
Exactly. Marxists saw the state eventually withering away as class tensions, which they saw as the source of the state, disappeared.
Okay, a necessary phase for Marxists.
But anarchists, as we've seen, saw the state as evil and oppressive in its own right, regardless of which class supposedly controlled it. They made no distinction between a bourgeois state and a so-called proletarian state. Both were equally instruments of domination.
So any state is bad.
Any state is bad. Therefore, they argued, a genuine revolution must involve the immediate and final abolition of state power. You don't let it wither, you actively tear it down from day one. No compromise on the state.
That's a fundamental difference in strategy and philosophy. It explains the split. Now, within collectivist anarchism itself, there are specific forms, right? You mentioned mutualism, anarcho-syndicalism, and anarcho-communism.
Exactly. They represent different ideas about how that stateless cooperative economy might actually function in practice.
Let's start with mutualism, associated with Proudhon.
Yes, strongly with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who, as I mentioned, stands a bit as a bridge between the individualist and collectivist traditions. He's complex.
He's the one who famously said property is theft. That sounds pretty collectivist.
It does. That's from his book, What is Property? But our source clarifies that he wasn't against all private property. He made a crucial distinction.
Oh, what was it?
He distinguished between property that allowed exploitation, like owning large factories or land that generates rent or profit from others' labor without working it yourself.
Right, absentee ownership.
Exactly. And possessions, or usufruct, the right to use something, like the tools of your trade, your house that you live in, the land you cultivate yourself. He condemned the accumulation of capital that enabled exploitation, but supported possession for use.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
Yeah.
Who did he admire economically?
He admired small-scale, independent producers, peasants, craftsmen, artisans like the Swiss watchmakers he knew, people managing their work and lives through mutual cooperation.
So what did mutualism look like as a system?
He envisioned mutualism as a system of equitable exchange between individuals or small cooperative groups. Social interaction would be voluntary, mutually beneficial, and harmonious, based on fair exchange of labor or goods representing labor without profit extraction or government intervention.
Like a cooperative market, almost.
Kind of, yeah. Focused on fair exchange, not profit accumulation.
Did his ideas lead to any practical attempts?
Yes. His followers tried to set up mutual credit banks in France and Switzerland.
Mutual credit banks.
Yeah, the idea was they would provide cheap loans covering only administrative costs without making profit, aiming for non-exploitative finance to help workers and producers. This idea of labor-for-labor exchange also aligns with early U.S. individualist anarchists like Josiah Warren and his experimental time stores.
Interesting connection across the Atlantic. Okay, so mutualism is a cooperative but still somewhat individualistic form based on fair exchange. Next, anarcho-syndicalism. This is the one with the mass base in Spain.
Right. This was revolutionary trade unionism, syndicate meaning union in French. It drew its strength from organizing workers in syndicates or unions.
Based on class conflict.
Very much so, based on a pretty clear notion of class war. They saw workers and peasants as oppressed by a broad class of exploiters, not just industrialists and landlords, but crucially also politicians, judges, police, the whole state apparatus that supported the system.
How did the unions fit in?
Workers would defend themselves and fight back through these syndicates, typically organized by craft or industry.
So the unions were both defensive organizations fighting for better conditions now.
Exactly. In the short term, they functioned like conventional unions, fighting for wages, hours, better conditions.
And also tools for revolution.
Precisely. They were fundamentally revolutionary organizations aiming for a social revolution to overthrow capitalism entirely and seize power for the workers themselves, organized through their syndicates.
Any key theorists here?
The French theorist Georges Sorel was influential, though maybe not strictly an anarchist himself. He's known for his idea in Reflections on Violence that revolution could be sparked by a general strike.
The general strike. Everyone stops working.
Yes, a mass withdrawal of labor, a revolution of empty hands, as he put it. Sorel saw the general strike less as a precise tactical plan and more as a powerful political myth, a symbol capable of inspiring workers and galvanizing mass revolt.
Why were anarchists so drawn to syndicalism? It seems like a specific strategy.
It appealed to them for two main reasons. Firstly, it provided a practical framework for direct action,
Meaning?
using boycotts, sabotage, strikes, and ultimately the general strike to exert pressure and achieve goals outside the corrupting realm of conventional politics and elections. Direct economic power.
Okay, and the second reason?
They saw the syndicate structure itself, the union, as a model or prefiguration of the future anarchist society.
How so?
Because unions, ideally, could be organized in a decentralized, non-hierarchic way based on grassroots democracy within the workplace or industry, and then federating horizontally with other unions. It looked like a practical example of anarchist principles in action.
So the union was both the means of struggle and the blueprint for the future society. That makes sense. But it ultimately didn't achieve its revolutionary goals. Why not?
That's right. Our source notes that despite its popularity and moments of strength, anarcho-syndicalism often lacked a clear, strategic, or theoretical plan for how to actually carry out and consolidate a revolution beyond the somewhat vague idea of a general strike spontaneously leading to change.
Relied too much on spontaneity again.
Perhaps. This reliance on uprising without detailed planning contributed to its failure to achieve lasting revolutionary objectives, and there were criticisms, even from other anarchists, that focusing too much on immediate short-term union goals like wages and conditions could lead towards reformism, making unions part of the capitalist system rather than instruments for overthrowing it.
A constant tension for radical unions. Okay, finally, within the collectivist camp, anarcho-communism. This is described as the most radical form of collectivism, associated with Peter Kropotkin and also Errico Malatesta.
Yes, this takes the belief in social solidarity and cooperation to its furthest point, advocating for full communism, meaning common ownership of all means of production and free access to goods and services based on need.
So getting rid of private property and money altogether.
Essentially, yes. The idea is that fundamentally sociable and gregarious humans should live a shared communal existence. Since labor is inherently social, we all depend on each other. The wealth produced by society should be owned in common by society.
And private property.
Seen here as definitively theft and the root cause of exploitation, inequality, and social conflict. They argue it encourages selfishness, fosters conflict between owners and workers, and breeds negative emotions like greed, envy, and resentment, which in turn lead to crime and disorder.
So abolishing private property would lead to a more harmonious society.
That's the core belief, yes. And this is strongly tied to Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid that we discuss.
Right, the biological basis for cooperation.
Absolutely. It's rooted in a highly optimistic view of the potential for human cooperation and solidarity. Kropotkin used his biological arguments for mutual aid to suggest that humans have a natural inclination towards sharing and collective endeavor.
What kind of society did they envision?
He admired small, self-managing communities throughout history, like those medieval city-states, peasant communes, seeing them as models. Kropotkin envisioned a future society composed of networks of self-sufficient communes where wealth was held in common.
Communes. Small scale again.
Generally, yes.
Huh.
A crucial point here is that, unlike Proudhon, who worried that communism might require an authoritarian state to manage resources and distribution, anarcho-communists like Kropotkin and the influential Italian anarchist Errico Malatesta argued vehemently that true communism could only exist with the complete abolition of the state. Because the state, being inherently hierarchical, centralized, and coercive, is fundamentally incompatible with genuine communal sharing, freedom, and voluntary cooperation. You can't have true communism imposed from above. It has to arise freely from below.
Okay, so what were the perceived advantages of this communal organization from the anarcho-communist perspective?
Our source points to three main advantages they saw. Firstly, shared living and collective endeavor would strengthen compassion and solidarity, encouraging mutual support and curbing individual greed and selfishness. It fosters better human relationships.
Makes sense.
Second, Decisions would be made through participatory or direct democracy.
Direct democracy. Explain that.
Popular self-government, where citizens are continuously involved in making the decisions that affect their lives directly, face-to-face in assemblies, rather than electing representatives. This is the only form of government they find acceptable, people directly governing themselves without intermediaries.
Okay, everyone participates. That sounds challenging on a large scale.
Exactly, which leads directly to the third advantage they emphasized. They valued small-scale, human-scale communities.
Why small scale?
Because it allows for that kind of face-to-face interaction, genuine direct democracy, and people managing their own affairs without alienation. They saw centralization, large states or organizations, as inevitably leading to depersonalization, bureaucracy, and the return of hierarchy. Keep it local, keep it human.
Okay, that gives us a comprehensive view of the collectivist tradition, rooted in socialism and community, emphasizing cooperation, collective ownership, solidarity through mutual aid, direct democracy, and often favoring decentralized communal living. Now let's pivot to the other major branch, individualist anarchism. Where does its philosophy come from?
Its philosophical foundation is firmly in the liberal idea of the sovereign individual.
Back to liberalism.
Yes, it takes liberal individualism, the emphasis on the importance and autonomy of the individual, and pushes it to its absolute logical extreme. As we noted earlier, William Godwin's early anarchism can be seen as an extreme form of classical liberalism.
So the core idea is the ultimate primacy and freedom of the individual. Everything revolves around the individual.
Yes. In the classical liberal sense, freedom is primarily seen as negative freedom, the absence of external constraints or coercion. Individualist anarchism pushes this to imply individual sovereignty.
Individual sovereignty. What does that mean exactly?
The idea that absolute and unlimited authority resides within each person. You are your own ultimate authority.
Yep.
From this perspective, any external constraint is seen as inherently evil, a violation of that sovereignty. But the constraint imposed by the state, which claims ultimate sovereignty and is compulsory and coercive, is seen as the absolute evil.
Because if you're subject to laws made by a state, you can't possibly be truly sovereign over yourself. It's a direct contradiction.
Exactly. The core argument is that individualism, properly understood, and the state are fundamentally irreconcilable. As the philosopher Robert Paul Wolff argued, the autonomous man, insofar as he is autonomous, is not subject to the will of another. If you accept the premise of individual autonomy, you must, logically, reject state authority.
How does this differ from standard liberalism, then? Liberals also champion individual liberty and constitutional limits on government. They're not anarchists.
There are key differences, and they're crucial. Firstly, on the question of guaranteeing freedom, classical liberals believed a minimal state, a night watchman state, was necessary precisely to protect individuals from each other, to prevent theft, violence, fraud. Law, in their view, protected freedom by restraining those who would infringe on others' liberty.
So the state protects freedom.
For liberals, yes. Modern liberals go further, seeing state intervention as potentially necessary to enhance positive freedom, the actual capacity to act and achieve one's goals.
Yet individualist anarchists.
They reject this completely. They believe that individuals, if left free from state interference, can live peacefully, harmoniously, and prosperously without government policing them. Free individuals, guided by reason or rational self-interest, will interact constructively. Conflicts, they argue, can be resolved through voluntary arbitration or reasoned discussion, not state force.
So their optimism about human potential or rationality, even from an individualist perspective, leads them to believe the state's protective function is unnecessary, or even counterproductive, because the state itself coerces.
Precisely. It's seen as creating the very problems of coercion it claims to solve. The second key difference is on controlling government. Liberals believe state power can be tamed or made legitimate through constitutional and representative institutions.
Like constitutions, checks and balances, elections.
Right. Constitutions limit power, checks and balances divide it. Regular elections ensure accountability to the people. That's the liberal democratic ideal.
And anarchists just dismiss all that.
Entirely. They dismiss it as mere facades, window dressing for naked political oppression. They argue that all laws, regardless of whether they are constitutional or arbitrary, democratic or dictatorial, infringe upon individual liberty by imposing external will. All states, by their very nature as concentrations of compulsory coercive authority, offend individual liberty. Trying to control or limit state power is pointless. It must be abolished entirely.
So constitutional checks and balances don't make the state acceptable. They just make its inherent oppression seem legitimate, maybe even trick people into consenting to it.
That's the core individualist anarchist critique. It's a much deeper rejection than just wanting smaller government.
Okay. Within individualist anarchism, there are different forms representing variations on this core idea, right? Our source mentions egoism, libertarianism, and anarcho-capitalism.
Yes, those are key strands.
Let's start with egoism, associated with Max Stirner.
Mhm.
That sounds pretty radical, even for anarchism.
It is, and perhaps the most philosophically extreme statement of the sovereign individual you'll find. Stirner's major work, The Ego and His Own, takes individualism to its ultimate, some might say terrifying, conclusion.
How so? What is Stirner's egoism?
Well, egoism can simply mean self-interest, and as Hobbes and Locke argued, that kind of basic self-interest might actually necessitate a state to prevent a free-for-all.
Right. Restrain everyone's egoism.
But Stirner's concept is different. It's a philosophy where the individual self, the unique ego, is the sole center of the moral universe. The individual should act purely as they choose, completely unbound by any external concepts like laws, social conventions, religion, or even traditional morality.
Unbound by everything. That sounds like nihilism.
It definitely borders on or embraces nihilism, a rejection of all external principles or values that might constrain the unique individual ego. Stirner called these external constraints spooks or ghosts, fixed ideas like humanity, the state, morality, God, that people allowed to dominate them.
So how does this specifically lead to anarchism?
Because any external authority, the state, law, moral codes, God is seen as one of these spooks, a fixed idea that illegitimately constrains the unique sovereign ego. It points logically towards atheism and an extreme individualist anarchism, where the individual is beholden to absolutely nothing but their own will and power.
What impact did Stirner have?
Our source notes that Stirner's direct impact on the wider anarchist movement was somewhat limited. He offered few practical ideas for organizing a stateless society, and was perhaps too philosophically radical, turning his back on the Enlightenment rationalism that influenced many other anarchists.
More a philosophical outlier.
In terms of the movement, perhaps, his influence is seen more broadly in philosophy, inspiring thinkers like Nietzsche and 20th century existentialism, with his focus on radical individuality and authenticity.
So a potent philosophical statement on individualism, but less influential on the practical side of building anarchism. What about libertarianism, particularly the strain that developed in the USA?
This represents a more pragmatic and arguably more influential stream of individualist argument in the U.S. context. Thinkers like Henry David Thoreau, Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, and Josiah Warren are key figures here.
Thoreau, famous for Walden and civil disobedience.
Exactly. Thoreau focused on self-reliance, simple living, and the quest for spiritual truth outside conventional society. Politically, his essay Civil Disobedience is crucial. He took Jefferson's famous motto, "That government is best which governs least," and adapted it to the anarchist sentiment. That government is best which governs not at all.
A clear progression there.
For Thoreau, individualism led directly to the idea of civil disobedience as a moral imperative. Faithfulness to one's individual conscience was paramount. You must do what you believe is right, regardless of society's demands or the government's laws.
Conscience above law.
Yes, individual conscience, in this view, stands above any supposed political obligation. He famously acted on this, refusing to pay taxes that supported slavery in the Mexican-American War, and spending a night in jail for it.
So Thoreau's contribution was emphasizing the moral authority of the individual over the legal authority of the state and the legitimacy of resistance based on conscience.
Yes, a powerful focus on principled non-cooperation and individual moral responsibility. Now, Benjamin Tucker, another key figure in U.S. individualist anarchism.
Okay, Tucker, what was his focus?
He tackled the practical question more directly. If we have all these autonomous, sovereign individuals, how can they possibly live and work together productively without constant conflict?
The big question for individualism. How did he answer it?
He saw two main potential solutions proposed within the tradition. One, following Godwin, was reliance on human rationality. The belief that conflict could be resolved through reasoned discussion and debate, as truth eventually displaces falsehood.
The optimistic rationalist approach was the other.
The other, favored by himself and Josiah Warren, was using a specific mechanism to spontaneously harmonize independent individual actions. Market exchange.
The free market as the solution.
Yes. Josiah Warren, for instance, believed strongly in the sovereign right of the individual to the property they produced through their own labor. He argued that economic logic and the benefits of the division of labor would naturally compel individuals to interact and cooperate.
How would they cooperate fairly?
He believed this could be achieved through equitable labor-for-labor exchange without capitalist profit. His experimental time stores in the 1820s tried to implement this, where goods were priced based on the hours of labor required to produce them and exchanged using labor notes.
Interesting experiment. And Tucker built on this.
Yes. Tucker famously argued that genuine anarchism is consistent Manchesterism, explicitly linking his anarchism to the 19th century laissez, free trade, free market principles associated with British liberals like Cobden and Bright. He saw the unfettered market as the key to social harmony without coercion.
So, for this significant stream of American individuals in anarchism, the free market is seen as the natural, non-coercive mechanism for achieving order and cooperation among free individuals.
Precisely. It's the spontaneous order that arises from individuals pursuing their own ends through voluntary transactions without needing state direction or interference.
Okay, this leads us logically to the third form, anarcho-capitalism. This sounds like the most extreme, market-focused version.
It is. It's a more contemporary development emerging strongly in the latter half of the 20th century, heavily influenced by the revival of classical, liberal, and Austrian school free market economics, often associated with the New Right or libertarian movements.
Who are the key thinkers here?
Figures like Murray Rothbard, David Friedman, and sometimes thinkers like Ayn Rand or Robert Nozick are discussed in this context, though their positions vary.
Robert Nozick is often associated with the idea of a minimal state, a night watchman state, not necessarily full anarchism, right?
That's correct. As a prominent right-wing libertarian, Nozick, in his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, argued for a minimal state limited solely to protecting individual rights against force, theft, fraud, and enforcing contracts. He argued this minimal state could arise justly without violating rights.
So how do anarcho-capitalists differ from Nozick?
Anarcho-capitalists take the free market logic further than Nozick's minimal state. They advocate for the complete abolition of government altogether, replacing it entirely with unregulated market competition.
So no state functions at all?
None. In this vision, all property is privately owned by sovereign individuals who interact solely through voluntary contracts driven by self-interest. The individual remains completely free from state coercion, and the market mechanism is believed capable of regulating all social interactions, providing order spontaneously.
But what about things liberals, even minimal state liberals like Nozick, argue the market can't provide efficiently or justly, like basic security, law enforcement, courts, national defense, the core public goods?
That's the key point of departure from even minimal state liberalism. Anarcho-capitalists argue, quite radically, that the market can satisfy all human wants, including those traditionally considered exclusive domains of the state.
How could the market provide police protection or courts?
Murray Rothbard, a major figure in developing anarcho-capitalism, argued extensively that protection from force and fraud could be delivered competitively by private protection associations or security agencies. Disputes could be resolved by private courts or arbitration services, entirely replacing state police and judicial systems.
Private police and private courts. How could that possibly work without leading to chaos or maybe oppression by the strongest private security force, like warlords?
That's the common objection. The anarcho-capitalist argument is that these profit-making agencies would be forced by market competition to offer better, more efficient, cheaper, and more responsive services than a coercive state monopoly. Private courts, for instance, would need to develop and maintain a reputation for fairness, impartiality, and effectiveness to attract clients, individuals, businesses, insurance agencies.
So reputation competition would keep them in check.
That's the theory. Crucially, unlike the compulsory authority and funding taxation of state entities, contracts with these private agencies would be entirely voluntary. They would be regulated by market forces, customer choice, the need to maintain reputation, potential boycotts, competition from rivals. Individuals or groups would choose which protection agency or court system to subscribe to or use, creating competition for legitimacy and effectiveness.
It's a very different vision of how security and law could work. Are there any real-world trends or examples they point to as supporting their case?
Our source mentions that proponents sometimes cite trends towards privatization in Western countries as small steps in this direction. Things like the increasing use of private prisons in the USA and UK, the growth of private security firms, experiments with private arbitration and alternative dispute resolution bypassing state courts, and even community initiatives like Neighborhood Watch taking on responsibilities traditionally held by state police. These are seen as demonstrating the potential for market-based or voluntary provision of security and order.
Okay, that's a fascinating range of alternative stateless societies proposed by anarchists. From collectivist visions of communal sharing and worker control to individualist visions ranging from Stirner's sovereign egoism to the pure market interactions of anarcho-capitalism. They all agree the state is the enemy, but their proposed alternatives couldn't be more different.
Right.
It really highlights that internal tension.
That tension between social solidarity and individual sovereignty is indeed a core dynamic running through the entire history of anarchist thought. It defines the major fault lines within the ideology. Now, let's turn to what is arguably anarchism's biggest practical challenge. If the state is evil and needs to be abolished, how do you actually get from here to there? What are the practical roads to anarchy?
Right, the question of strategy. Given their fundamental rejection of the state in conventional politics, I assume it's not about forming a political party and winning elections.
Absolutely not. That's completely antithetical to their core beliefs. Our source highlights that anarchists have often struggled more with implementing their ideals on a large scale than they have with articulating them.
Theory versus practice.
Exactly. They frequently turn away from active mass political engagement, often focusing instead on writing, philosophical work, developing theory, or building small-scale alternative communities and living experiments.
Why is that?
Because they're not just apolitical in the sense of being uninterested. They are often positively anti-political. They are actively repelled by the processes, compromises, and hierarchies inherent in conventional politics and state structures.
This creates a fundamental strategic problem, though. If you won't engage with the system, how do you dismantle it? It seems like you sideline yourself.
Exactly. That's the perennial dilemma. Their core principle is that if the state is inherently evil and corrupting, then any attempt to participate in it, influence government, or even build a large hierarchical organization to fight it is inherently compromising and counterproductive. It risks recreating the very power structures they oppose.
So, electoral politics, running for office, lobbying, all that is out.
Completely rejected. Political power is seen as oppressive, regardless of how it's acquired, whether through the ballot box or through violent seizure. Political parties, even revolutionary ones, are viewed with deep suspicion as being inherently bureaucratic, hierarchical, and ultimately aimed at capturing state power, which is the opposite of the anarchist goal.
So the very idea of an anarchist government or an anarchist political party or even an anarchist politician is seen as a contradiction in terms.
A total contradiction. It just doesn't compute within their framework.
So if the conventional road is both blocked by principle and undesirable anyway, they have to find less orthodox means to achieve change. What are the main approaches they have explored historically?
Our source focuses on three main approaches that have been tried or advocated within anarchism: revolutionary violence, direct action, and nonviolent protest.
Okay, let's start with revolutionary violence. That sounds intense.
It has a complex and often controversial history within anarchism. In the 19th century particularly, there were significant efforts by figures like Bakunin to rouse the masses to armed insurrection. He led conspiratorial groups, participated in failed risings. Others like Malatesta in Italy or followers of Zapata in Mexico sought peasant revolution through armed struggle.
Did these mass violent efforts succeed?
Generally, no. They often failed, partly because, as we discussed, they relied heavily on hopes for spontaneous revolt rather than sustained organization and strategy. And, as we also mentioned, anarchists lost ground to better organized communist movements in the 20th century, which often had more coherent military and political strategies.
And then there's the more notorious aspect of violence associated with anarchism: terrorism and assassinations.
Yes, that approach saw a definite peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often described by proponents as propaganda by the deed.
Propaganda by the deed. What does that mean?
It involved acts of what the source calls clandestine violence bombings, assassinations targeting prominent figures of authority like royalty, presidents, ministers.
Who were some victims?
Well-known victims included Tsar Alexander II of Russia, King Umberto of Italy, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, President Carnot of France, and U.S. President McKinley.
Wow, major figures. Who carried out these acts?
Often they were carried out by individuals acting alone, like Emile Henry in France, or by small clandestine groups like the People's Will in Russia who assassinated the Tsar. There was also a resurgence of similar tactics by some far-left groups claiming anarchist or related influences in the 1970s, like the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany or the Red Brigades in Italy.
What was the anarchist justification for using violence and terrorism? It seems so contradictory to the ideals of freedom, cooperation, and spontaneous harmony.
That's the obvious tension. Their justification was distinctive, though. They often framed these acts not just as political tactics to achieve a goal, but as inherently just and fair in themselves, a form of retribution or revenge against those they saw as the primary oppressors.
Like revolutionary justice.
Exactly. They argued that violence originates from the state and the ruling classes through exploitation, war, and repression. Anarchist violence, in this view, merely mirrored this systemic violence, but directed it back at the supposedly guilty parties.
What were they hoping to achieve practically with these acts?
The stated goals were typically twofold. Firstly, to demoralize the ruling classes by showing they weren't invincible, but they could be struck down. Secondly, to stimulate the masses to revolt by demonstrating that action against authority was possible, that the state wasn't all-powerful. The idea was that the dramatic deed itself would serve as propaganda, inspiring others to rise up.
Did it achieve those goals in practice? Was it effective propaganda?
Our source concludes that, in practice, anarchist violence, especially terrorism, has generally been highly counterproductive.
How so?
Far from inspiring mass revolt, it typically provoked public horror, fear, and outrage. This severely damaged anarchism's popular support and often served to isolate the movement from the very people they hoped to inspire.
Right. And challenging the state with violence seems like playing on their home turf.
Exactly. It's also an unpromising way to make rulers relinquish power, as it challenges the state on its strongest territory, its near monopoly of organized force and coercion. Ultimately, terrorism in both historical periods tended to provoke states into expanding and strengthening their repressive machinery. More police powers, surveillance, harsher laws, often with increased public backing because of the fear generated by the violence.
So while a historical reality and a feature of some anarchist thought, violence hasn't been a successful path to achieving widespread anarchist goals.
Generally not, no. It often backfired significantly.
Okay. What about the second approach, direct action? That sounds broader.
It is. Direct action encompasses a wide range of tactics, short of full revolutionary assault or clandestine terrorism. It basically means taking action directly to achieve a goal, rather than going through intermediaries like politicians or relying on state processes.
What kind of tactic?
It can range from passive resistance and civil disobedience at one end, through things like strikes, boycotts, occupations, disruptions, sabotage, all the way up to potentially more confrontational protest actions. Anarcho-syndicalists, for instance, relied heavily on direct action, like boycotts, sabotage, and strikes as their primary alternative to conventional politics.
We see this today, too.
Very much so. The modern anti-globalization movement, where anarchist influence is significant, also heavily relies on mass protests, demonstrations, disruptions, various forms of direct engagement and pressure.
What's the appeal of direct action from an anarchist perspective? Why prefer it?
Our source highlights two key advantages they see. Firstly, direct action is seen as uncontaminated by the compromises and corruptions of government and state machinery. Discontent and opposition are expressed openly and directly by the people themselves, not filtered, co-opted, or managed by politicians or constitutional processes. It keeps the oppositional force independent and authentic.
Okay. Purity and independence. What's the second advantage?
Secondly, it's inherently a form of popular political activism that can be, and often is, organized via decentralization and participatory decision-making, reflecting core anarchist values. It bypasses hierarchical structures. This aligns with what's sometimes called the new politics style.
New politics.
Yeah, a style often seen in contemporary social movements, environmentalism, feminism, global justice, which distrusts traditional representative mechanisms like parties and interest groups, and favors more innovative, often theatrical, forms of popular mobilization and direct protest. Anarchist ideas heavily influence this style.
It sounds effective at raising awareness and disrupting the status quo, making noise, Does it have limitations as a strategy?
Yes, it does. While powerful, it can sometimes damage public support if perceived negatively, leading to accusations of irresponsibility, extremism, or just being disruptive nuisances in mainstream discourse.
Alienating potential allies.
Potentially, yes. And while it effectively attracts attention, it can limit actual political influence by defining the group as an outsider, unable or unwilling to access or impact formal public policymaking processes. It's arguably better suited for protest and resistance than for constructing and implementing large-scale alternative systems.
Okay, that makes sense. Finally, what about the third path? Nonviolent protest.
Many anarchists, including important early figures like Godwin and Proudhon, saw violence not just as tactically flawed, but as abhorrent in principle, directly contradicting their ethical ideals.
So a principled rejection of violence.
Yes. And consequently, many anarchists have been strongly attracted to the principles of nonviolence and pacifism, drawing inspiration from figures like the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy and, perhaps most famously, Mahatma Gandhi.
Neither Tolstoy nor Gandhi were strictly anarchists themselves, but they had sympathetic ideas.
Exactly. Our source notes their significant influence. Tolstoy, for instance, vehemently critiqued corrupt modern civilization, state violence, and advocated for a simple, rural, self-sufficient life based on Christian principles of love and absolute nonviolence.
And Gandhi.
Gandhi developed the incredibly powerful philosophy and practice of satyagraha, meaning truth force or soul force, a form of active, mass, nonviolent resistance in his struggles against discrimination in South Africa and later for Indian independence. He was heavily influenced by Tolstoy, Hindu principles of ahimsa, non-harming, and Thoreau's civil disobedience.
Why does nonviolence appeal so strongly to some anarchists?
It appeals for two key reasons that align deeply with anarchist philosophy. Firstly, it reflects their optimistic view of human nature and the inherent belief in treating other human beings with compassion, respect, and recognizing them as moral, autonomous agents. Using violence contradicts that core respect.
Okay, it aligns ethically. What about strategically?
Secondly, nonviolence can be seen as an incredibly powerful strategy. Refraining from force, especially when faced with provocation or state violence, demonstrates a profound inner strength, moral purity, and discipline that can resonate deeply, win sympathy, expose the injustice of the opponent, and potentially disarm them morally.
It takes the moral high ground.
Precisely. It aligns with that core anarchist idea of spontaneous order arising from positive human qualities like reason and empathy, rather than being imposed by external force.
What kind of actions do nonviolent anarchists tend to favor?
Anarchists drawn strongly to pacifism often tend to shy away from large-scale confrontational political activism and mass movements. They might prefer instead to focus on building small model communities.
Intentional communities, communes.
Exactly. Communities that try to embody cooperation, mutual respect, nonviolence, and ecological sustainability in their daily lives. Their hope is often that these exemplary communities will demonstrate the viability and desirability of stateless, nonviolent living by contrasting their peacefulness and fulfillment with the quiet desperation, as Thoreau memorably put it, of conventional, state-dominated society. Spreading change by example.
So three quite distinct approaches to achieving anarchy, reflecting the deep strategic dilemmas posed by their fundamental rejection of conventional power, from violent revolution and terrorism to disruptive but often non-lethal direct action, and the quiet, principled example of nonviolent communities. It really highlights the internal diversity and the practical challenges of the anarchist project.
It certainly does, and despite these historical struggles, the failures to gain national power and periods of relatively low profile throughout much of the 20th century, anarchism has proven remarkably stubborn and persistent. It keeps coming back.
You mentioned signs of revival, particularly linked to libertarian strands that emerged in both the New Left of the 60s, 70s and the New Right for the late 20th century. That seems counterintuitive, left and right revivals drawing on similar ideas.
It might seem so on the surface, but both movements in very different ways picked up on and were influenced by anarchist or, more broadly, libertarian ideas emphasizing individual freedom and a deep suspicion of centralized power.
How did the New Left connect?
The New Left of the 1960s and 70s thinks student activism, anti-war protests, counterculture, early environmentalism, feminism had a strong unifying theme of liberation, often focused on personal fulfillment and autonomy. Crucially, its activist style was heavily based on popular protest, grassroots organizing, and direct action, which clearly shows anarchist influence, even if they didn't always use the label.
Okay, and the New Right, that seems like the opposite end.
The New Right, particularly its libertarian wing emerging from the late 20th century onwards, emphasized individual freedom guaranteed primarily by market competition and minimal government. Here, figures associated with anarcho-capitalism were actually quite influential in the intellectual rediscovery and championing of radical free market economics and highlighting the perceived evils of state intervention, regulation, and welfare programs.
So for a period, anarchism's main role was perhaps less about being a distinct movement aiming for power itself and more about acting as a critical force, challenging and fertilizing other ideologies, socialism, liberalism, conservatism, by constantly emphasizing the coercive, potentially destructive nature of political power, pushing them in more anti-authoritarian directions.
Yes, that was arguably a significant function for much of the 20th century. It kept the radical critique of power alive on the margins and pushed other ideologies to grapple with questions of freedom and state authority, even if they didn't adopt the full anarchist position.
But you said this dynamic shifted significantly more recently, from the late 1990s, with the rise of anti-capitalist and anti-globalization protests.
Yes, that marked a noticeable change.
And this is where we saw activists openly identifying as anarchists again in larger numbers.
Exactly. Our source notes that many participants in these protests, starting perhaps most visibly with the Seattle WTO protests in 1999, explicitly called themselves anarchists. This marked a potential reversal of the long trend after World War I, where Marxism had largely overshadowed anarchism as the leading ideology on the radical left. Anarchism seemed to be regaining visibility and appeal.
Why this reanimation now, in the specific context of globalization? What makes anarchism relevant to critiquing global capitalism?
Anarchism's core principles, its enduring emphasis on individual autonomy, grassroots participation, decentralization, anti-hierarchy, and equality, turn out to be particularly effective tools for articulating concerns about the power structures of contemporary global capitalism.
How so?
The vast scale and often diffuse, unaccountable authority of global corporations, international financial institutions like the WTO, IMF, World Bank, and military alliances feel like a new, perhaps more insidious, form of concentrated power operating beyond the reach of traditional national democratic controls. This resonates strongly with the long-standing anarchist critique of any form of unchecked domination.
So global institutions become the new state to oppose.
In a sense, yes. And anarchism provides an effective, ready-made activist-style protest, agitation, direct action, affinity groups to express these concerns and directly confront these institutions.
And we saw this manifest clearly in events like the Battle of Seattle.
That protest against the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle in 1999 is often cited as a prime example of this new anarchism's activist style, a theatrical, decentralized, activist-based politics using mass protest and direct action against the symbols and institutions of global capitalism. It was a style that was replicated in subsequent anti-capitalist protests around the world in the following years.
What makes this contemporary wave of anarchism particularly appealing, especially to young activists involved in these movements?
Our source suggests several factors. There's its inherent resistance to compromise, its rejection of the perceived betrayals and political expediency, often associated with conventional political parties and hierarchical organizations. It offers a kind of purity.
That moral clarity again.
Yeah. There's also a strong rejection of consumerism and the perceived emptiness of brand culture, seeing the equation of personal happiness with acquiring material possessions as another form of external control or false fulfillment imposed by global capitalism.
A critique of materialism.
Definitely. This new anarchism is also sometimes described as post-ideological.
Post-ideological. What does that mean?
It often lacks a single, rigid theoretical core like classical anarchism or Marxism. Instead, it embraces and connects a wide range of issues: pollution, environmental destruction, animal rights, sweatshops, consumerism, urban development, gentrification, gender inequality, global north-south disparities, seeing them as interconnected symptoms of a flawed system, rather than focusing narrowly on just the state or just economic class struggle.
So more eclectic and issue-based.
Yes, it offers a politics lived in the moment, centered on immediate resistance, creating alternative spaces and ways of organizing without necessarily needing a fully worked out grand strategy or a detailed blueprint for a future society.
And figures like Noam Chomsky provide some theoretical connection or inspiration here. He's often linked with anarchist ideas.
Yes. Our source notes that Chomsky's influential critiques of U.S. foreign policy, corporate power, media manipulation, and globalization are often underpinned by assumptions that align closely with anarchist thinking, particularly the idea of the inherent corruptibility of human institutions and concentrated power. He applies these critical assumptions to analyze contemporary global dynamics, though his work isn't always framed strictly within classical anarchist theory, and he engages more broadly.
So it sounds like for many contemporary activists, it might be more of a broad sensibility, an ethical stance, or a critical impulse, rather than strict adherence to the historical anarchist texts or doctrines.
That seems to be the case for many, yes. And this leads to some doubts raised in our source about whether this constitutes a deep, long-term revival of anarchism as a cohesive political movement capable of fundamental systemic change.
Why the doubts?
Well, the source suggests this current anarchism might be better understood for many involved as an impulse or sensibility rather than a rigorous engagement with the historical ideological system or the classic thinkers. The deep strategic debates of the past, like the intense anarchist-Marxist conflict over the state and revolution, seem largely alien or irrelevant to much of this new wave.
Less focus on theory, more on action.
Perhaps. And a distinct, systematic anarchist critique of global capitalism itself, one as robust and detailed as the historical anarchist critique of the state, hasn't fully emerged yet, even in prominent figures like Chomsky, whose critique draws on anarchist assumptions but isn't solely defined by them.
And it's operating within a very broad and fragmented anti-capitalist movement itself, with many different ideologies present.
Exactly, and the anarchist element within that diverse movement is also often highly eclectic and sometimes internally contradictory. The post-ideological nature, while potentially widening its appeal by addressing diverse issues and avoiding rigid dogma, may come at the cost of overall political effectiveness. It lacks a unified vision or coherent long-term strategy.
So it keeps the spirit of resistance alive, but maybe struggles to offer a clear path forward.
That's the potential downside. It keeps the idea that a better world is possible alive through its resistance and creation of alternatives, but offers limited, clear ideas on how that world would operate on a large scale, or how to strategically achieve it beyond protest.
And finally, there's the persistent challenge posed by anarchism's principled rejection of leadership and formal organization. Does modern technology help overcome that?
That's a key question. While modern technology like mobile phones, encrypted messaging, and the internet has been incredibly effective at facilitating the kind of self-managed, decentralized, network-based activism seen in recent protests and demonstrations.
Making coordination easier without hierarchy.
Yes, it's very good for that. However, it's not clear if this technology overcomes the longer-term disadvantages of lacking formal structures. Without more stable forms of organization, it remains difficult to develop and sustain a broad, effective mass movement capable of strategic planning, resource mobilization, and achieving more than just episodic protest or localized experiments.
So the very qualities that make modern anarchism attractive, its spontaneity, its emphasis on self-expression and individual autonomy, its deep suspicion of power and structure, might also be the source of its practical limitations in building a sustainable movement capable of fundamental, large-scale social change.
That's the complex and somewhat paradoxical conclusion suggested by our source. Its strength lies in its purity as a moral critique, its adaptability, and its power to inspire direct action and alternative ways of living. But its inherent resistance to structure and unified strategy remains a significant hurdle for achieving its ultimate, incredibly ambitious goal of a truly stateless society.
This has been a really extensive and, I think, quite eye-opening deep dive. We've challenged those common perceptions of anarchy as just chaos and explored the complex history, the core ideas, and the internal diversity of anarchism as a political philosophy.
We really covered a lot of ground, from the origins of the word itself and its transformation by Proudhon, through the foundational ideas of Godwin, the revolutionary struggles involving towering figures like Bakunin and Kropotkin, and the rise and fall of mass movements like anarcho-syndicalism, particularly in Spain.
And we've unpacked those core themes. The absolute unwavering rejection of the state and all forms of compulsory authority as both evil and unnecessary.
Right. The underlying, often utopian, belief in natural order, spontaneous harmony, and human potential for cooperation and reason.
The historical hostility towards compulsory religious authority or anti-clericalism.
And that deep division over the nature of economic freedom, splitting anarchism fundamentally into its collectivist visions, mutualism, syndicalism, communism, emphasizing cooperation and shared resources.
And the contrasting individualist visions, egoism, libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, emphasizing individual sovereignty and market mechanisms, championed by thinkers from Stirner and Tucker to modern anarcho-capitalists.
Absolutely.
And we've looked critically at the different, often difficult, roads anarchists have taken in pursuit of that stateless ideal, from the controversial history of revolutionary violence and propaganda by the deed, to the more consistently applied and arguably more influential strategy of direct action in its many forms, and the alternative path of principled nonviolent protest and attempting to build model communities based on anarchist values.
And finally, we've seen how anarchism, despite its historical setbacks, has persisted and found new relevance, perhaps more as an impulse or sensibility than a rigid doctrine, within contemporary movements like anti-globalization and anti-capitalism, even while facing those persistent strategic challenges of organizing without hierarchy.
We've seen how specific figures and powerful quotes, like Proudhon's searing diatribe against being governed, or Emma Goldman's stark symbols of state power, the club, the gun, the handcuff, really capture the emotional and ethical essence of the anarchist critique of power.
They definitely stick with you.
Hopefully this deep dive has significantly expanded your understanding of anarchy beyond that simple idea of mere chaos, revealing it as a rich, challenging, internally diverse, and historically significant political tradition.
Definitely more complex than the stereotype.
So as you, our listener, reflect on all this, maybe ask yourself, do any of the core anarchist critiques of authority of the state, of economic exploitation, of religious dogma resonate with you, perhaps in ways you hadn't considered before?
Yeah, does it make you question things you normally take for granted about power?
And how do you see that fundamental tension? We kept coming back to the tension between individual autonomy and freedom on one hand, and social solidarity, cooperation, and equality on the other, playing out. It clearly divides collectivist and individualist anarchism, but you see echoes of that tension in other political ideas you encounter, maybe even in your own daily life, your relationships, your workplace.
It's a fundamental human tension, really, and anarchism explores its extremes.
And here's a final provocative thought to leave you with, building on our discussion. Given anarchism's historical failure to achieve lasting national power, its persistent internal divisions between individualism and collectivism, and the profound strategic difficulties of organizing collectively without any form of leadership or hierarchy.
All those challenges we discussed?
Is anarchism primarily valuable today as a powerful, enduring moral critique of power in all its forms? Is its main role to be a source of radical ideas that challenge the status quo, inspire specific forms of resistance, direct action, and alternative community building?
Acting as a critical conscience, perhaps.
Right. Or, despite all these significant historical and practical challenges, does it still hold genuine potential as a viable path towards a fundamentally different stateless society in the future? Could new conditions, maybe new technologies facilitating decentralized coordination, allow anarchist principles to manifest in ways that weren't possible for earlier generations? Is the stateless society still a plausible, maybe even desirable future goal?
A big question to ponder. Is it just a critique, or is it still a destination?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of anarchism. We hope it's given you a lot to reflect on.